Welcome everyone. This is our Fireside with Sean Celli. His background has been at Apple and T-Mobile for the past 17 years. He's helped open over 20 countries. And I'm really excited to kind of get to talk about several key topics that you guys all submitted around COVID and how it's impacting recruiting, this friction that can occur between compensation and recruiting, as well as how to manage compensation offers or recruiting processes across various size companies. So Sean, welcome. We're
Thank you.
excited to have you here today. I took a little bit of an intro, but if you would like to, I'd love to hear a bit about your past and history.
Sure. Well, I don't want to bore everybody because some people probably know me. I'm sure that I've worked with a couple of people that are on the call today, but I'm super thrilled to be here. I've, just in meeting you and your team recently, I think you've got a really cool product. And, I think one of the things that drew me into recruiting or talent acquisition, years ago was I used to lead businesses. As you know, I grew up in the retail industry. In fact, I got my first job in the U.S. The night before I got married. I moved to the U.S. Yeah, my future in-laws said yes with me not having a job, so I guess I was very charming. But at any rate, I grew up in retail. I was in jewelry, and then later in office supplies. And, and I got into recruiting because the talent wasn't coming to me. It was very much of an applicant-based business, and I needed people to be able to sell, large diamonds. Some of the diamonds we were selling, and this is quite some time ago, were, anywhere between $50,000 and $100,000. And not just anybody can do that. And my view was, if somebody can sell shoes and put that on someone's feet at Nordstrom, they could probably sell a diamond. So I went and started finding their own talent and brought the talent into me. And so, it became something that I was sort of doing off the side of my desk and found out that I was pretty good at. Ended up being cold called. And for those of you that haven't done that, that means you actually made a list of people that worked at a company. You would find out who was good some way. You would phone them and say, I'd like to talk to you about an opportunity. And I got that call to come to Apple about just over 20 years ago. And it was to launch the retail stores. And, we went there, no playbook. In fact, the first 10 stores we launched without even advertising anything. We didn't advertise we were opening stores. We had to do everything a little bit cloak and dagger and be very creative. This is pre-LinkedIn. The recruiting did happen before LinkedIn, by the way. And so, we had to get very creative on how we found talent. And it's interesting when you think of everything that we're doing in today's world, with a real focus on, pay equity, a focus on diversity in the workplace, whether that's gender diversity or underrepresented minorities and so forth. When you're building retail businesses, you actually have quite a diverse candidate pool. And I was surprised, in launching, I think it was the 5th country I launched. I was the first person for Apple retail on the continent in Europe.
Mm-hmm.
So I was in England, and I didn't realize, what an incredibly diverse city London was at the time. I had a bit of a North American mindset. But it was also the summer in 2004 when Eastern Europe was allowed to start working very easily in the UK, and that changed a lot in terms of the diversity of candidate pools. So that was pretty exciting. So I did that for many years. I led businesses around, or led the recruiting around the world. And then the final 3 years, I retooled the organization as far as the corporate recruiting organization. See, these are all the different pillars when you think of recruiting functions. So operations, technology, university recruiting, all those sorts of things. And rebuilt, because what we needed to do is something that you and I'll probably talk about a little bit later, was make sure that all the teams, starting with the business, but finance, compensation, HR, recruiting, all having the same mindset to say, what is our goal? So not just a subset of those teams are working together. I was viewing things, because I grew up in businesses, looking at things with a very commercial mindset. So understanding comp was always really important to me, but I found out that many people in HR didn't have the same mindset because they were looking at it just from a talent perspective, but not maybe the holistic picture. So that's why I got into recruiting. I've loved doing it over the years. And most recently, as you mentioned, I did that at T-Mobile as well, retooling the talent organization, becoming much more cohesive in the way that we think about talent from all the different groups and the really rich resource groups there are at that particular organization. The employee groups are well represented, well attended, and then how they can help us become a much richer talent pool. So I love that stuff, and I'm really thrilled to talk to you about it today.
Awesome. I mean, it's an amazing background, and I think it pairs really nicely with a lot of the topics today, because something that we've talked about in posting about this fireside, and just in conversations with anyone who's had any questions, is there is usually some friction between comp and recruiting, and it doesn't have to be that way. So I'm coming with my experience from working on teams at Google, Instacart, Cruise, all in compensation, often partnering with recruiting and trying to lead those programs out. And all of us right now are in a weird predicament with COVID. It's thrown a wrench into many of our processes and expectations.
Yeah.
So I think where I'd love to start, because I'm sure it's top of mind for a lot of people, especially with elections around the corner, everything feels up in the air. But what has been some trends that you've seen? And maybe we can talk about some ways that you've seen companies being creative in tackling those.
So it's interesting. So first of all, I don't think that the remote recruiting isn't new, but the way that this all came about so quickly would really turn people on, kind of almost like a knee-jerk reaction, or like it kind of got a bit of whiplash to some degree,
Yeah.
So I left T-Mobile, right around the time this is coming in. So I think what's been interesting for me is I've been able to look at this in much more of a consultant lens. I've been talking to a lot of organizations, helping them think through like, how do we approach this, whether it's the groups on LinkedIn or people that I've industry friends with. And there's a lot of real basic questions that people started with, such as I've got 6-7 months ago, it's like I've got this pipeline of talent. They all need to start right away. Like, how do we onboard them? It was very tactical things. Like, we need them to start. No one's in the office. What are we going to do? How are we going to do the I-9? Just these very tactical things, which causes you to take your strategic hat and then roll up your arms, you roll your sleeves, and like you got to kind of dig deep really quickly. Sometimes it's the less interesting work, but it's really important. And then it's like, okay, then you've got to start to get a rhythm, and companies were starting to say, okay, now we're saying that maybe we're going to be remote, and and there was this thinking even 4 or 5 months ago that maybe it'll be a long time before we go back in the office. Clearly, the first 2 weeks that we thought that was going to be a change, right? And so it's like, where do you start sourcing? And again, I think that this is not new, but many companies have rich relocation policies, and so recruiting from many places is easy. Because you can bring them in. Let's just talk about our country, the U.S. for right now before we start talking immigration policies. And so you can recruit from anywhere, and that's sometimes problematic, because it's like, okay, like, where do you start? Do you start with skills? Do you start with location? And so once you kind of once the company sort of honed in on that, you realize, well, if we are going to have a remote first workforce, kind of like the US or the world as our oyster, but that can be a bit challenging if you haven't done some of the hard work around really understanding what matters to the hiring manager. So they're trying to unpack that a little bit.
Yeah.
Then we have the piece around the sort of the immigration issues and the things that are associated with that. So you could say, like, I can recruit from anywhere, but you kind of can't, because there are limits on what you can bring into your country, into your company, and all the things related to your compliance and your immigration teams, assuming that you partner with them quite closely. I hope that we all do. And yeah, and I think that there's this other piece that's really important too, especially if you're a smaller company that might not have as many offices as some other larger organizations. Is there are tax implications. You might not have an entity set up in different states, right? If you think about having, thinking, oh yeah, we'll be fine with having a remote workforce, but there's a lot of things we need to think about that related to where are the people going to work, not just where I find them, but can they actually work there? And so it's a little bit backing into the actual question is, we need to know that information before we go after the talent. The last thing I'll say is companies that have a smaller relocation offering, in other words, they don't like to do that, to some degree, limit their pool, but yet they have an advantage because they know precisely what the pool is. It's my backyard only. We don't move people. We only advertise here. But you also limit your pool from an availability perspective, certainly from a diversity perspective. So having that information, I think, is where many recruiters in particular have struggled, because the hiring managers actually don't know yet. Like, they haven't figured out, are we remote first? Are we open to it? How do we work in that way? Are we going to be on Zoom forever? Are we as effective? We think we are, but there's been ebbs and flows if we've been all reading the data, right? So that's the things that I've been seeing. I think from there's also this piece around infrastructure, if I can just share something quickly.
Oh, yes.
So, we've all seen that video works, right? So a lot of people are having conversations, whether it's one-to-ones or interviews or webinars or whatever, on video. But doing everything on video, which has become quite commonplace, needs to be thought about, like, where does it fit within your tech stack? And that's really important from a compliance perspective, because tracking things. So I spent many years in recruiting, as you know. And my sweet spot is not capturing information. I love to have the conversation. I love to talk about people or candidates or hiring managers, but all of that needs to be captured, for OFCCP, for compliance reasons, for candidate experience reasons, all these sorts of things. And when you add this other element where it's all remote and it's all on video, or much of it is, it needs to be like, is there a way for it to be automatically captured? And to some degree, you're flying the plane while you're building it, because most organizations have the technology to use, and there's a number of really good ones to use. Maybe it's not a Zoom, but there's other ones that are in the recruiting space. But they're not necessarily attached to their system of record, whether it's their CRM or their ETS. And that can be a little bit problematic if you're sort of a shoot, ready, aim, really fast moving type of individual. Most recruiters are. Competency recruiters are typically, they're highly driven for results and they're highly customer focused. But high administrative skills are typically not in the top 5. So, those are things to really think about. And some companies have struggled with, like, how do I, package that all together? But I think, if you map it out, and it can be a fairly, relatively easy exercise, then you can make sure that you're not missing any steps along the way, so that the important things around compliance and the really important things around, the experience of the customers, which are the hiring managers and the candidates, aren't missed along the way. Does that make sense?
It does. And I think it's, for what Pequity does, we do have an offer management software, and a lot of it comes to compliance, because also in compensation, we're highly driven by what is documented, what is the data, what did the candidate ask for expected, and what is their competing, and do we have documentation on that? And it has to be stored somewhere for us to be able to respond quickly. So a lot of what we're incorporating in the tool is feedback around that, in hopes of easing it off of recruiting, right? Because you guys have the hard job, you have the sell, you have to get in there and talk to them. Having systems that don't talk and automatically capture it, it's a nightmare. We recognize that.
Totally. Absolutely.
Especially with COVID, I mean, the conversations that I know a lot of people are very concerned about, and I think it's causing complications for recruiting, is what's going to happen to my compensation, right?
Yes.
Most of these companies are saying, we'll localize you. Some are saying, we'll localize you up to a certain percentage. And when it comes to selling an offer, I know I've been experiencing with a couple of companies, candidates who say, oh, well, I can't move to SF today, but I'll move after COVID's over. So if you want to offer me the SF pay now, and it's a weird conversation, because they're not wrong, where you're like, okay, like, we do want you in SF, and that's probably not going to happen for a year. So where do we pay you? Is it based on where your role is supposed to sit and where your teammates are technically paid at right now? Or is it at the location that you're at today? So I wonder, from your perspective, with, I think recruiting is getting kind of beat up over all this stuff right now, and I really feel for them. Do you have any words of advice kind of around navigating those kind of sticky conversations?
Well, I mean, every company has their own views and policies around these things, right? What I will say is, understanding what your company policy is on it gives you like, so data matters. And so
Hmm.
if you understand the data and the thinking behind it and the rationale behind that, it allows you to be able to share something with conviction. And this is why I think, having this partnership with the teams, I mentioned them earlier, that starting with the business, the comp team, the finance team, the HR business partners, maybe there's legal in there as well. And probably in this case, legal is really important because someone is signing a document that, as you said, I'll move to San Francisco in the future. And what if they're performing really well somewhere else? Like it actually becomes, a really important discussion to say, we're going to move within 12 months. And we've all seen these things in the past where, 12 months, they're loving earning the good salary living in Idaho. But we're saying that, no, you're going to move. So, understanding that data and be able to speak to it confidently, I think is probably the main advice that I would give. The other thing that I would say is I would be hesitant hiring too many people on a future location salary. Hire them to where they are, and you can tell them what they'll be earning in their future place, because it's the cost of living differential and all these different things that go into it that is really important. Just in prep for this call today, I actually spent some time looking at some technical roles, which is certainly not me, but I looked at them, and I saw 3 straight positions that said, remote until 2021, then that will be revisited, but in time it will be in X city. One was New York, one was San Francisco. It did not say what you'd be paid, but it's an interesting one, right? So, because it's really difficult with some of the larger cities to be able to make back that difference regardless of where you live. It just isn't the case. So I think data and understanding the information is super important.
Well, and to that end, I know we just talked about how recruiters aren't necessarily, and I think, again, they are talking to people every day, which is something I don't have to do. They're selling, they're building their relationship. And it probably is hard to take all of that and compile it down into some sort of documentation for everyone else. But a data-driven process, you've mentioned a couple of times, is pretty critical to the success of a recruiting organization. So besides just documenting and finding better systems, what's your take? Like, what's the benefit from your perspective a little bit more? And also, how can you build a better data-driven system?
So, I love recruiters because they're super passionate, right? It's sort of like you get the news shiny object and we're off and running. There's a challenge to that though, and it's a service-based approach, but if you're not careful, it can be a little bit shoot ready aim. So I sit down and have a meeting with you're the hiring manager. I sit down and meet with you, and I'm off to the races before I actually understand the rationale why the guidelines are going to be X. Maybe it's and maybe it's more than I thought. So I don't know that information before I actually go do the research. So there's time waste for the candidates, potentially for the hiring manager, for me in recruiting, and then you're automatically creating some level of friction in a process because you've excluded somebody. And so, I think that when you get the input of the data, whether it's a range of compensation, a total package, understanding what markets pay certain things and why, I think that really helps. In the same way, I would say to a hiring manager before I had my team launch a search, I would say, listen, we're going to go and find out who is in the market where you want to be hiring right now, and what the availability is around, let's say around the States, around the Western half of the States, so forth. So if you say you want to, inject some diversity into your organization, I would work with HR team and find out what is the makeup of your organization right now? What is it going to look like to bring in 5 people if you've only got 3 today that are maybe African-American engineers? And are your leaders ready for that? So you have the data around that. Understand that when you go into a different city, what the pay may look like, what does the makeup look like, what's the experience level, and having that data actually turns recruiting and recruiters from being a job filler to actually being really a consultant and a business partner. But I love the idea that that in recruiting, you have to have a bit of knowledge of everything in there, but you have a clear swim lane. Like it's really clear what you do. And you bring the right partners in that have their level, their type of expertise, and let them speak to that. And then whoever that customer is, let's assume that it's a VP of engineering or something, like it's all about data for them. Not just it's not just a level, it's the type of thinking, right? And it's very binary. And so leverage that. But by nature, oftentimes, recruiters can be a little emotive, highly intuitive. And so we feel a lot of things, but the feeling actually doesn't matter. It's actually the data is what matters. The challenge is we actually don't know what data to ask for oftentimes. And I think that, it's becoming more important. You see oftentimes on LinkedIn and so forth, we need to have data-driven recruiting organizations, that and the other. But if you ask people actually what they want to share, they are unclear. And having the data in front of you to, have almost like a North Star, like this is what the business wants. And it can't be the simple things like how fast I fill jobs. It's the higher things like, are we transforming an organization? Are people staying longer over time? All that sort of thing. And is it because we paid them right? Is it because we actually had them land in an organization where there was readiness and a leader was ready to lead people that were different than them, or they were caring more, whatever it happens to be? That stuff actually influences future decisions rather than just saying, I've got a rec, I fill a rec, and I rinse and repeat that. Does that make sense?
It does. And I like the thought around everything you put in of having a process around it. I think that's from a comp perspective, even whenever we go into a company and we see that they haven't set up calibrations before they open the rack, they even assign like a level or a job going, like we just want a software engineer. And it's hard because you go out and they might find a machine learning engineer and they come to us, they're like, we love him, he's the best thing ever. And we find out the comps are too high because we just didn't have that upfront discussion and data. So I think that that's spot on. And I think that goes to, to segue slightly into the topic that I'm excited about, the friction that can happen between compensation and recruiting. And I would love to hear from your perspective a little bit of what you think that friction is. And I can share mine as well. And then we can just talk about some of those like solutions that we were chatting about before.
So it's funny, I think that, we talk about how important learning agility is, and the definition from my perspective is that you learn and course correct during the experience. It's not like afterwards. I'm pretty quick on the uptick, but sometimes I'm not. And, when you start to see the same thing happen over and over again, it's like someone sort of knocking and saying like, wake up. And I made this mistake a few times where, especially in the early days, where I noticed it most was in my earlier Apple days, where the business and me, we would often go and we would scope out a new country and we would start working really fast. We would find that we would be trying to solve different things, and we would get this input, whether it was talent, because in different places, people share things more readily than is becoming a sort of legal obstacle in the US now around, how much you earn, that sort of thing. We can, if we really want to go there, we can. But, so we were getting all this information and then coming back with and informing compensation. This is what we need to do. And they're like, we're working with all of our research and our comp partners. And why did you, I built friction into the process, and it was my fault. And the challenge for me was the person that I was creating friction with was an amazing human that's actually a really good friend of mine still. But it's like, and so, when I had this, this challenge a couple of different times, I'm like, we've got to figure out how we include the different partners earlier. Because, oftentimes they're only included when you're actually getting ready to hire, because we didn't even write job descriptions for some of these new places. So I'm like, we need to think about, like, pan back and say, when we're going to have an uptick of hiring, whether it's new roles, new location, these sorts of things, who needs to be sitting here? Let's not do the work until we actually have that criteria, determined. And so, so bringing that together, I think, is important, and I've seen it at, my two most recent large, companies, that there has been, some friction. I've also been a part of, I think, lessening that friction to the point where one of the greatest weekly one-to-ones I had was one of the directors in comp. We would walk at T-Mobile, and we would just walk and have our touch bases and go through things in that way, because that was the way that worked for us to be able to talk about vision, so we knew what was coming.
Yeah.
I think that's really important. And the other thing I will say is there is an annual friction that takes place if we're not careful.
Yes.
And that is, most organizations, when you have a new fiscal year, you get a ton of new requisitions. So you've got new roles. Hiring managers are calling the recruiters and saying, let's go. And at the same time, the comp team is actually getting ready for total rewards or whatever you call it at your company. And they're heads down for like 4 to 6 weeks thinking we've got to look at, 5, 10, 50, 100,000 people around, what is criteria, what is comp, what is RSUs look like. And we need to map those things out, knowing that it's like Groundhog Day. It happens every year. Yet friction happens every year if you're not careful. So I think that getting ahead of it and really making sure that you're inclusive in the way that you work is what matters the most. Mm-hmm. It does mean that sometimes you have to set some expectations with some of the managers in the business who want to move a little quicker and think that they're the one in the company. And that's not true, right? There's you can feel that way and it not be that way. But that's what I've done. I'd love to hear what you think.
I think that's spot on. I mean, my experience in the space, Google had an amazing process behind them with a lot of collaboration with recruiting and a highly systematized everything. So if you wanted to open a rec, there's a process for that. Benchmarking had a process, and it all kind of flowed. But when I went to a couple other companies, my first mistake I made was not consulting recruiting to start, getting handed a bunch of recs and saying, okay, we have to do our benchmarking. I'm going to do my data assessment. And data, I live by it. I live and breathe it, of course, as a comp person, but it doesn't tell the whole story. Yeah. You have to talk with your hiring managers and your recruiting team about who those critical talents are and where are we struggling with bringing people in, and why is that? Is it a certain hiring manager that we need to go coach with? Is it our sources that we're going through, and how can we kind of measure that data? So that was a first mistake on my part of not incorporating from the beginning. So I feel you on that inclusiveness comment. Yeah. And other thing I think was comp it's a lot of information, and the time that it can take sometimes to train up your partners, it feels daunting. So the way we handled it on my first team when we were small, we tried to put a lot of approval steps, so red tape all over everything. Yeah. And all that does is create this friction of making recruiting feel boxed out. And I think that that's a default that a lot of comp teams have, unfortunately. And it's a bit driven by the lack of tooling and systems in the space, because how do you get, anonymized peer data on every offer that goes out the door? How do you share ranges and make sure it's the hiring range, not the whole range if they have a performance factor in there? Yeah. And what do you do to then make that scalable when people, especially in recruiting, are probably bouncing around all different recs and in different roles, and they're changing teams. And that was something with Pequity that we did lean to solve. So we have baked it into our offer process. And I'm very passionate about it, because I do think a lot of times by putting in those red tapes, comp teams accidentally increase pay disparities. Because if recruiters don't have perfect information, if they're not looped into the right decision-making points, then they're going to make decisions in a silo under a time crunch. And that's the worst time to make a decision without data. And that's going to lead to some weird outcome that you're going to have to fix in your pay system later. So that's a lot of the impetus for this. And I do think if you don't have a system like Pequity, but having more conversations, having more transparent processes, if you're not going to share everything, at least explaining why, or taking the time once a quarter, once a year, even when we're doing our benchmarking exercise, the total rewards exercise that you're talking about, where we disappear and don't talk to anyone, just looping in recruiting at that point has, exponential benefit for the org, because they at least understand what you're doing in the data. And I've often found that recruiters, some of my best conversations that challenged my beliefs and changed the way that I looked at comp came from recruiting, because they do have that, eye to the field and know what's coming our way a little bit more than the rest of us. So I can echo that. And I think that those are some common flaws that hopefully no one on this call is making. But if you are, take away the red tape. That's the number one thing I can say.
Well, I think you're spot on. I think it's interesting, so really what you're saying is like recruiters have feet on the street. Now we do know that what we hear from people, you have to, sometimes it's accurate, sometimes it's not, because,
Oh,
everybody's, the king of the world on LinkedIn, but, you might have been a little prince or something. You can write whatever you want and you can say whatever you want. And that's why, the data and the research that the comp, when it comes down to dollars and cents and so forth, really
mhm.
matter with the comp team. I think that that training and education is so important. And the more that that the talent teams, whether that's internally or externally, can be, really well informed to be able to speak about, the total rewards and what goes into the package to be able to represent those things. It really matters, especially as you start talking to, different parts of the country or different industries that might not have had some of the types of rewards or packaged in the same way that
Yeah.
some more progressive companies have, right? So, when you think of PTO as an example, for some people coming into the company, and when your vacation, your sick time is all together, they don't understand that,
Hmm.
because that's into those separately. It's like, can I take that? Like, what does that look like? Why is that a benefit to me? And, when you
Yeah.
think of RSUs versus options, and like all those sorts of things that really go into sort of long-term play. What does
Yeah.
deferred comp look like when you're talking to some of your executive candidates and so forth? Your comp team understands that you understand these things probably better than most, recruiters. And so I made a practice of making sure that, people like yourself talk to the teams, so that, and then, and if there is a, super inquisitive, especially on the more senior executive candidates who, want to understand some things, like just connecting the dots there so they can talk to the comp team. I think it's really helpful.
Yeah.
Um, and then, of course, oftentimes you have external consultants that help with these things as well. But I think education with recruiting really matters, and that we don't try to be all things to all people.
Yes.
Know the lane and know it well.
I think that aligns well, and it kind of flows into the other topic that we wanted to talk about today of making those offers. Different stages of different companies, different countries, and um, different, comp systems. It changes the way that you have to look at every offer. You're never comparing apples to apples, I would say. And it gets really hard, especially if you're a small company. And I think especially in the climate today where really the big brands are the ones who are surviving COVID the best. And there's a lot of small, scrappy startups who, there might be some that were in a niche space that are responding very well. But I'm sure there's more who might be negatively impacted, and it makes it harder to sell. One quote that I had recently was someone that I thought was so sad, but they said everyone's heading for safe havens. They all want to go to the Google, the Facebook, the LinkedIn's, the Apples,
Sure.
because their equity is not going to get as impacted probably. They tend to have very progressive policies to protect their employees, and it leaves these small, vulnerable companies that just don't have the budget, who even might have to make cuts right now, compete even harder.
Yep.
And that's a tough space for a recruiter to be in. So I don't know if you have any, if you've ever had to be in a position where you had to really sell against one of the big guys, or have any kind of tips or tricks of the trade to kind of help with anyone who might have that right now?
Sure. So let me start by saying first that, when I joined Apple, the market share was not what it is today. So it was not an attractive place for people to work. And this is pre-iPod. It was a year before the iPod came out. So like nothing was even connected to it from a Windows perspective. So I do
Mm,
understand that even at a company like Apple, iconic, but heck, I don't want to work there. Always going to go out of business one of these days. It was really the reaction. Um, and I think that there's a lot of, companies that are dealing with precisely what you're saying. I want to add one other piece to that, if that's okay.
yeah.
um, that there's been a lot of racial unrest recently as well, right? And I
Yeah.
think that we all
Oh
know
yeah.
that. And when you think of how people look at choosing work today, it's really different than it was just a number of years ago. Certainly, since when I mentioned pre-LinkedIn earlier, but in the last number of years, with Glassdoor, with Blind, you can find out what employees say, and it's not just the upset employees that post, because if you look at many companies, that are in sort of the top 10, the CEO has a very high rating, and most of those ratings are from employees, not from candidates.
Yes.
And so I think there's some level of insight that you can get into what would it be like for me to work at the company? What would it be like for me to work for a company in this particular group? And I think that that today more than ever, when you add some of the racial unrest that's been going on, people are being very selective around, is that a place where I would land well? And our leaders, is the bias that's going on there, are they moving in this direction or that direction? Are leaders ready to lead people in a different way, whether it's gender, whether it's race, whether it's remote working, all these different things combined. And candidates are, they're getting past what you post on your company landing page for jobs. It says we're the shiny object, you need to come work here. To actually be curious and say, is it a place where people like me stay? Are we welcome? Do we feel like we belong? Is it an equitable place to work? And or am I going to be an only in the hallway? And if if I'm not an only in the hallway, if I have great ideas, are they going to be listened to? I mean, it's all that stuff, right? Yeah. And so I think that goes across all organizations, because a lot of the bigger organizations have struggled really, really badly in recent months on all these different things. They may have kept people because they're paying well and they're not laying off, but they don't have a happy workforce. So that makes recruiting difficult as well. And so it's something I think it's important to know. The sniff test today is great. We can get past the marketing stuff very well. So to answer your question, what I'd say is that there are different people that are drawn to different things. Some people, and it's not just an age thing, but many people have sort of characterized millennials that they want to be mission driven, and boomers being safer. And listen, I kind of fall in different categories here, and while there's a generalization, there's other personalities that say I'm a bit of a risk taker. I actually would want to stay fit, and that's why we have different jobs that attract different type of people. Not everybody's going to love going to a startup, and I think what's tricky in today's world with recruiting is that AI has become a really prominent part of the tool set. And what I mean by that is, so Amazon has grown dramatically. In fact, they've grown dramatically during the pandemic. Primarily with drivers and fulfillment centers, but they've hired hundreds of thousands of people, net, not gross. So gross has been massive, but even net, they've grown dramatically. And many of those jobs that are at hourly workers, they will get a job without actually ever talking to a recruiter, because they're going into a fixed place, and it's an AI-driven process. I don't like it, but I understand it means to the end. Most of the roles that we're talking about, there's a human interface at some point. Your resume looks good. I want to talk to you. And I think in that conversation, it's really important to understand, are they someone that's going to be connected with remote working? What gives them energy? Or are they going to be someone that's going to hate remote working? The water cooler really matters to them. Are they somebody that wants the big payoff now, or are they really willing to put it in and take the risk because maybe there's a cliff after 2 or 3 years potentially? And it comes down to the assessment that we in recruiting have to be able to do. And I think it's really important, because you don't want to find out those things at the finish line when you're going to make the offer and you realize, no, they don't want to take the risk because the risk is too great, the reward's too small, and the reward, the excitement of getting a big comp package, sort of quote unquote more guaranteed from one of the big five is connects with them. And so I think that when I look at STEM working in particular, especially with some of the young talent coming out of universities, they love to build. They want to build cool stuff. And you can do that in this, you get really hands dirty, you get on it in the smaller companies because you're building. you can be a part of something, but you're a cog in the wheel of the larger ones. And that might be for you. But I think finding out what motivates the talent, it helps you be able to determine, are they even going to be successful here? And you need to find that out really early on, especially if it's going to be a comp conversation. Because the truth is, you could have the potential of a rocket ship at a lovely startup, or you have the potential of just something more steady at one of the larger organizations. And
Yes,
that's a very personal decision.
it most certainly is. And it's, a lot of what you're talking about that I love is it's a whole holistic issue, right? Where we're talking about the diversity of your company and how you help them with career progression and the projects that are interesting to them. And it's not just comp, which I think is something we do coach a lot on, with especially small companies and even large ones,
Yeah.
because people, and I'm sure you experienced it too with Apple. The family companies out there get beat up by candidates too, because they come in and they're like, you have deep pockets, I want the world, and it's hard to say no because you probably could do it.
Yeah.
And it's not a good fit though, right? Like if someone comes into your small company or even a Google and all they care about is the compensation, they don't care about the projects, they're not interested in the team, they don't really have an interest in evolving or growing with the organization, you have to wonder, what are they there for? And are they even going to be there in a year? Because you're about to invest money, but also your team's resources training this person.
That's right.
So I think there's a lot there that isn't part of the negotiation per se, but it's part of the decision to even engage in the
Yeah.
negotiation
Yeah.
that I think is pretty critical.
But I think when it comes down to negotiation, like if you cover these pieces, like what's the motivation, why do they want to come, these sort of things that we talked about, then you need to be able to talk with conviction, like
Yeah.
about your package and understand that and not be apologetic. The package is what the package is. The company can pay what the company pays. And if it's not right, it's not right. Anytime that you try to shove a round peg in a square hole, it will end over time. I try to convince you, this is an amazing place. And, 6 months down the road, like you went with your heart, but 6 months down the road, you can't pay rent. It's not going to last very long. So the stars do need to align. And I think that conversation, is super important.
I agree. And thank you for all the commentary there. I do realize we have 15 minutes left, which is what we set aside for QA for everyone. As a reminder to the group, if you want to submit a question, you can add it to the QA at the bottom. It's a little button that just says QA. If you're unsure how to submit it, you can also add it to the chat, and one of our moderators, Warren or Zach, will add it for us. And to start, Sean, I will go through our questions. So do you think that the market data being collected related to compensation this year will skew the data and impact comp decisions post-COVID? So I'll take a first stab at this, and I wonder if you agree. We do think that there will be some impact to the comp data because there are a lot of, layoffs and different movement of the workforce. If I were to say, is it going to be a significant impact? I don't know how significant that will be. We haven't really seen it hurting tech, for instance. And Sean, in your experience, when there are these market dips, when we went through 2008 and the Great Recession, I don't know if you have any insight onto how that kind of impacted compensation around then.
So I do remember that. Listen, I was a part of pay freezes in my past life as well. These things happen. I would say that most companies are looking at this from a long game. You can't just kind of take a look at this year because there's so many organizations that are trying to decide right now, are we going to be remote? Are we going to be office? What is that going to look like? And if they're going to be remote, what does that mean if I allow you to go work in a different state? There's so many different implications to that. Are we paying differently during that period of time? Are we taxing differently? There's a lot to unpack there. I don't think there's going to be any rash decisions unless it's a company that's really struggling, to stay afloat. So 2008, 2009, was tough for a lot of organizations. It was tough at Apple, even for that matter. And bonuses were light for many people. Stock allocations were later, and so forth. But unless you're, what I would say from the experience that I had, and many of the, Bay Area companies at the time, many were a lot smaller at the time, but is that there was very few rash decisions. They kind of took a look at the long game, and we're able to, weather the storm as a result of that. But I think that what you said though around, people taking kind of a safe bet where they want to work, that can be a bit of an outcome because it feels safe if I've, got personal responsibilities that I need to pay for.
Yeah.
But I don't see it would, really skew the data that much.
Yeah. And I think everyone's in a holding pattern anyways. So the real outcomes of this is going to be tied to if there's a vaccine, the outcomes of the election, so many different factors that it's almost too soon to know. So I do know for interest of anyone, the majority, I would say 90% of companies that we talk to are waiting until May, June. And at that point, they're not even sure they'll have a decision. They think that they'll probably just have an update and it's going to go forward from there. So we're all waiting for that data to update. But because everyone's in a holding pattern, there isn't really that I can see a great impact at the moment.
Yeah.
Next question we have is, if a job description is generic because the project details are confidential, how do you engage top talent to apply?
So this is sort of the debate that often people will have is, are we expecting people to come and say, I want to work for you? Or are you going to find the person and say, I want you to work for us? Mm-hmm. And I think that question is, the way I would probably approach that is, if it's confidential, you shouldn't be posting it anyway. Is that you need to go find that talent, and you need to have things mapped out. We were talking about compensation today. Like, this needs to be very clearly mapped out ahead of time. And so when and there's a piece around normalizing, right? Normalizing job titles. So a VP here equals a director there, or equals a SVP there. And so that the comp team can say, like, you're going to be looking for these things. This is it. This is the way it's been mapped out. And you need to go find that person. So you're a hunter, not a gatherer. And generally confidential search is that way, because as soon as you post that, it's going to turn into a lot of speculation.
Yeah, I agree with that. What will back to work look like? When do we think it will happen? And what do people leaders need to be thinking about before, during, and after?
Well, if I had a crystal ball, I think it's a good question. You're seeing more companies announce daily, until 2021, until July 2021, no one's back in the office. It's a long time to make that, for someone to say, basically for the next 9-10 months, we're going to be a remote workforce. I do think it's important to reiterate, though, that some work just doesn't work remotely. And some jobs don't work remotely. Some people don't work well remotely. And then some people have more opportunity working remotely, but as leaders, you have to be super flexible. So, it can be really great for working mothers, and it can be really hard for working mothers. And so depending what type of lead, like if you're expecting to sort of like punch into your time clock, like I'm seeing that you're on some sort of internal chat, so I know that you're working. And so, like, there's a whole lot of cultural things to work through. But I think a hybrid model is probably what we'll see in the future of some sort. Many companies have had this already, but it was very informal. So, example, I've worked at some companies where it's like ghost town on Fridays. Just everybody just sort of work from home. It wasn't a work from home policy. It was just sort of happened, and you'll probably start seeing more of that. But I think we've also seen that there's certain work that can happen anywhere, but it's going to have to be documented and become more formalized so that you can do a couple of things. One is to make sure that you're hiring people in the right places, that your people are included, so you can diversify your workforce. And that also includes geographic diversity, which means you're probably getting people that have different standards of living, different backgrounds in that way. They went to different schools, all that stuff. So I think there's some good things that will happen there. But it does mean that our leaders need to learn how to lead differently. It can't just be about the work. Check-ins become more purposeful and more important. And for some leaders, that's going to be new.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
And just to echo on that, I think a lot of people are unsure when it's going to happen or how. I know there's some organizations who are testing out these new policies and practices. I saw there's a new startup that has like a smartwatch technology. It's a wristband they give to employees that buzzes you if you get too close to people. Some are trying to do rotating office assignments and all kinds of things to bring back a bit of a sense of normalcy. But we recognize it's here probably for the long haul. I think they just officially or semi-officially said that coronavirus is likely to be an endemic, like the flu. So until we try to get a vaccine or something to lessen the symptoms, it's going to be a very real hazard for a lot of employers as far as bringing your employees into office.
Sure.
So I think there's a lot of sympathy to your point. I do feel quite a bit for individuals who have vulnerable family members, be it children or elderly they have to care for. So
Yeah.
it's a delicate balance and something I think is top of mind for a lot of leaders that they have to get comfortable with quickly is learning how to have those sensitive, what is normally a private family fact and bring it to the surface and get the employee to trust and communicate with you. I think that employees will feel a bit vulnerable, especially with some of the unrest and uncertainty with jobs. So it's on the leaders and on the companies now to draw that out of the employee to make sure we build the systems that truly support them. That's some stuff that's a heavy topic for sure that we're all curious about. Onto a topic that's specific for you, Sean. What compensation differences did you see between different industries, especially in your experience at Apple versus T-Mobile?
There's some things I can share. I can't with that, obviously. But what I'd say is, so I'm going to be broad here. Some industries weigh heavier and are more aggressive when it comes down to RSU-based compensation, and probably total comp packages as well, and it does give you a bit of a leading edge to be able to attract top talent. There's no question. I think that one of the primary differences I see with the companies that are leading right now is that they put cash in people's pocket quicker. So the vesting cycle is quicker. The cliff cycle is quicker. So the initial vest and so forth. Bonus is more aggressive. And, so there's this can go two ways because I'm getting things more often, the long-term play isn't there, but you're always like a quarter away from something big. And, if you're giving people good work to do and you've got that quick recycle of comp, it's a winning combination. So that's that's the way I'm going to answer that question.
I think, I can echo it. And some of the companies that pop to mind when you're listing on their removing vesting and high, sign-ons with Facebook, they have their crazy sign-ons. Google and Facebook, I think, got rid of their cliffs at this point just to speed things up. A lot of it was, I think, to try and offset sign-ons. Like they didn't want to issue as many and that didn't work out. So they're just a lot of vesting and a lot of sign-ons everywhere. I do see a lot of organizations getting a bit more conservative with their refresh. I think people recognize that the waterfall where you have a cliff at year 4 that you fall off unless you get upped up by leadership or a promotion, it's good for churning out talent if you have that type of org, but it's going to churn out talent. So if you don't want to churn out your talent at 4 years, you need to come up with a more sustainable one. So I do see a lot of people trending towards like the boxcar model, if no one knows what that is, but it's just you pen grants on your 5, 6, 7, very flat vesting across. But a lot of that, as I'm sure you're familiar, Sean, it's up to the company's structure and what supports the business best, right? Like they try to build it around their talent potential. How quickly do we want people to be in and out? Do we want it to be an up and out organization, or do we want this to be steady Eddie, you're here for the long haul. So it's a deeper conversation, but there's a lot of interesting trends that people are popping up to address them.
Agreed.
And last question we have on here, but I think it's an important one. Curious about how, we have two, I'm going to combine them, but curious about how companies are approaching compensation for external versus internal talent as they work to diversify their leadership team. What challenges exist and how might organizations remedy them? And that goes into, do execs understand the talent wars and the importance of diversity on the ranks? I think those can go roughly into the bucket of diversity and leadership.
So one is specifically around leadership, and one's around, do leaders understand they should have a diverse team? We could talk about this for hours. I'm fortunate that I have people that are far more experienced in these areas than myself, that have been my guides for many years. But what I would say is, um, the needle has moved very recently to companies being interested. Some have been for a really long time, and so for that second question, do execs understand, the talent wars, around diversity and so forth? I think some do. I don't know that they understand how amplified that is right now. That,
Mm-hmm.
as an example, I have a really close friend who's a African American HR leader. She is phenomenal, and she's literally been called by every FAANG company, and she has not done anything different, but she's been called more recently. And she loves what she's doing. She's not going anywhere. But the war for talent with outstanding diverse leaders has been amplified more recently. And in some states, when you look at California, where they've been charged to diversify their boards, it's happening at a very accelerated rate. So I think some leaders are doing it for the right reasons, and other ones are hopping on board and they don't necessarily understand the complexity and the pace and all these sorts of things. You just can't speed up the harvest on these things. You have to learn, and it takes time to ask questions and be curious and understand how they're approaching companies. Gosh, I think this is a really tricky one, because internally, the truth is, if you just look at diversity in general, within the companies, that you can rectify your pay equity, and unless you have a team of leaders who are really approaching things without bias and are looking at the work and so forth, you may end up injecting some bias back into your internal equity decisions over time again. And unfortunately, that is still the case at many places. And so I think this is going to take time. And I love that there are some leaders who are really committed to being equitable, because you got to sort that out before you sort it out externally to what you're paying. Like it, because the internal is, you got to take care of your people before you start thinking of the external. But I think the more recent attention that's come here has been super encouraging. And but it's not, there's no magic pill to this. It's going to take time. It just is.
Well, that's a profound thing to end on for this fireside. Thank you, everyone who joined in. Thank you, Sean. We really appreciate your time, and it was a very insightful conversation. I got new things out of it even today, which I love. For everyone on the call, we'll be posting a recording of this onto our website as well as on YouTube, and send the link to anyone who RSVP'd. So feel free to share and spread all the word on how to improve your recruiting teams. And thank you, Sean, again. I hope you have a great rest of your week here.
Thanks. Take care. See ya.